Alright, hey guys. So, here is the last behind the scenes video for Strange Men, as the Hanged Man does not have any on VG Person's website. Not translator's notes nor Yuri's notes. If I can find some somewhere else, I'll read them, but until then, I'm just going off what's on VG Person's website. So, let's start with VG Person first. The Boogeyman Translator's Notes, Electric Boogaloo. Due to my role in this game, plain old translation notes wouldn't really suffice this time. Instead, you get translator's notes. Pretty much everything I can say about the game and its development, with the actual game script just being one part of it. This is kind of long and spoils everything. Make sure you've gotten the happy ending before this reading. And again, it is at this time that I will tell you to go watch Manly Badass Heroes, all endings of the Boogeyman before I proceed. Go do that. I'll be waiting. Okay? Watched it? Fucked up, right? Now I lay me down to sleep. The story starts, after us getting to know each other somewhat via me translating her previous games, with Yuri on Twitter saying how she'd like to have English voice acting for the third game of the Strange Men series. Planning was way ahead as usual, but at this point it was just an idea she was doubtful of the feasibility of. For those who weren't sure, yes, the English voices are in the Japanese game, which happens plenty in games with American settings, notably Silent Hill. Many Japanese comments on the Boogeyman say that the English voices makes it feel like watching an English movie with subtitles. I can't really remember how it went, but later she seemed more intent on trying it, or at least seeing if it would work. I didn't do anything for a while, figuring she had a plan or would eventually contact me. Eventually I decided to email her offering my help and... Quote, "Yeah, no joke, VG Person is a god among us. VG Person's kindness does laps around the world," unquote. She sent me the audition post to translate. At this point, I had absolutely no knowledge of the Sandman beyond one screenshot, and all I knew of the Boogeyman was the post I was translating, which everyone called Man A and the like. Still, I translated it for her ASAP. The original plan was to post the audition on Voice Acting Alliance, but their forum was broken. Thankfully, she got a fair amount of auditions from Twitter and my Tumblr post. Once she'd made her decision, she sent me a file with the character names, sprites, and winning auditions. This was the first point at which I had any idea there would be characters from the previous games. Again, I knew nothing of the Sandman, so I didn't even know that had David and Shirley. And the first time I saw Sophie and Richard even. Not much happened for a while as Yuri worked on the Sandman. She started having me translate emails to be sent to the voice actors, and also a response to those who didn't make it. Eventually, she started appending things to like, "Are you well?" It's getting cold to her emails. I mean, she informed me that she wanted Sophie and the Boogeyman's voice actors to record brief lines for the Sandman, so I translated that email too. To spoil the absolute most important part. At the end of November 2013, when she had a rough idea of when she'd release the Sandman, which ended up being about 2 months off, she felt somewhat pressured to get started on things because of the actors waiting to do their part. So she sent everyone detailed character bios and the first part of the script up to meeting everyone on the ship, allowing them to start recording lines. Of course, she did this by sending them to me for translation first. These character bios really revealed a ton of stuff. Everyone's pasts, Todd and his death, who the Boogeyman really was, that there'd be a playable Sophie part intended to show how Keith's perception of the Boogeyman is unreliable, etc. The voice actors only got their own character's bio, and in some cases a few others, but of course, I got everything. However, Davosity, the Boogeyman's voice actor, got everyone's bio so as to match how the Boogeyman himself knows everything about the attendees. Now then, some excerpts from this amazing document. Rather than being chased by your foes, as in the Crooked Man and Sandman, you are now the one chasing the Boogeyman. To spoil the most absolute important part, the Boogeyman is actually Brendan Dumont. Helena often teased him, saying he'd make a good comedian, but Keith became a detective instead. I like to make people smile, but there are times when that's not easy for people to do. I want to protect people and give them peace, so they can all smile. It's more of a general thing than one quote, but apparently the Boogeyman did single out not only Keith, but David, wanting David to fall into despair over Shirley's death before he killed him. Evidently, he really did look at his history and think, how can I make this guy's life even worse? While Helena may seem weak, she actually has immense strength when it comes to protecting the ones she loves, even being willing to die for them. Also, David hates anchovies. That's a hint for something in-game, so it's somewhat important. While David isn't the protagonist, he does have a very important role. There's a scene where Keith goes to light a cigarette and his lighter won't light, so David lends him his. That scene symbolizes how he shows Keith the light and, in a sense, guides Keith. Brendan is abducted by the boogeyman while he's sleeping and is decapitated as sacrifice. Except that was all a big lie. In truth, he is the boogeyman. The two couples in this game, the Barings and David and Shirley, are presented as total opposites. Keith and Helena act as shields to protect the other, while Shirley and David protect each other back to back. They trust each other and let the other cover their back. They come off as less of a married couple and more comrades in arms. Sophie hates being treated like a kid, so when Keith calls her young lady, she retorts with old man. Actually, back when David was detained for trying to kill his mother, Eric was the detective who heard his case. Eric had a sick grandmother himself, so he felt sorry for David and worked to release him ASAP. Another thing was that she mentioned Shirley was a coin locker baby, which is the thing in Japan where unwanted babies are left in coin lockers and many die. Uri knew this was Japan-centric and requested an equivalent term, since Shirley's American and all. I proposed dumped baby, i.e. a baby left in a park or something. Though when it came to actually mentioning it in-game, a better indirect phrasing surfaced, but that's getting ahead of things. Let's start at the beginning. Opening. As a general note for the original dialogue scripts versus what appears for text boxes in-game. In the games without voice acting, there are a lot of considerations for how to present a line. In essence, things that add up influence to how a player will mentally read it. Ellipses, extended words, stutters, capitalization for emphasis, multiple exclamation marks, etc. can affect the tone of a line without technically changing the actual words. It's hard to explain my thoughts on this stuff in detail, but I pay attention to it. However, these things are different when there is voice acting, yet they also play a role for conveying the tone to VAs in the script beyond outright instructions. So the script generally contains more of the aforementioned things than the voiced version's final text. When creating the translated version at the end, I did my best to check every single line against what the voice clip was actually like and make it look right. Sometimes the reading of the line would be slightly different, intentionally or otherwise, so I changed the text accordingly. I definitely didn't want it to feel there was an incongruity between what was said and what was on screen. Besides just feeling unprofessional, it would sort of take you out of the game. As for the scripts themselves, they were somewhat like movie scripts, general descriptions of the settings, characters' actions, and numbered lines of dialogue, with basic parentheticals for smaller actions and things like laughing, sighing, etc. How much detail Uri gave varied quite a bit. I suppose it got better over time, with her increasingly explaining motives and what the characters were thinking to help give enough context for good acting, as the voice wasn't in a fully playable state yet. In retrospect, it may have helped for me to add more notes of my own about how I'd picture the line being read, but of course I'd need to be careful about what I actually had the right idea if it wasn't something Uri explicitly stated. As I said, for the early scripts, the Sandman wasn't out and I knew little about it. Thus, I was translating the early scenes with this being my first look at Sophie, and that's essentially why she says Papa instead of Dad now, because she's super affectionate with him in the Boogeyman. Luckily, the whole growing up theme of the Sandman ended up working okay with this. Sophie never had time to be a kid, so she's trying to catch up now, and using a childish name for her father is part of it. Also, unless Chocolate did retakes later, I know some did, but I didn't pay them close attention, I'm fairly sure they didn't get to play the Sandman before recording these early lines, which would have given them more of an idea what Sophie was like, even if she is intended to have changed since the Sandman's resolution. Arriving at the castle. The part where you're waiting outside of the castle before meeting Brendan was, oddly enough, added in a while later. Originally, the scene just started with Brendan introducing himself. I guess Uri added it for the sake of showing some interaction between Brendan and his servants on top of just Stevie, making him seem nicer and less suspicious, as well as the one who killed them all. Of course, it also added the Barings, who are not the Andersons who I know all about, but that's great, of course, part. A stage direction from when the Barings arrive in their room and Helena brings up Europe. Helena talks to Keith, but one can sense how she's pushing herself to sound like she's having fun. Come on, Dick, was just originally just Dick. And, it's not like I couldn't have done that given the language that ended up being used later, but the D-Day thing is a reference to Doubleday in What Dreams May Come. However, in Japanese, Yuri just wrote 2D, so I didn't understand it at all, and it translated as 2 directions for the auditions. But I asked Uri about it since it was so baffling. Can't you see, Keith? Our marriage is 2-dimensional, and corrected it once she pointed out the reference. There were a few times when Uri asked me to translate a message to a voice actor to help clarify the details of a scene for retakes, as well as cases where she anticipated that further explanation would help and sent an extra message to the actor. However, it seems like she did a good job of this by herself without me even seeing it. She only asked me to translate if it was too complex or detailed. History of Castle Livingstone. Uri had me translate the whole big thing for the quickly shown book pictures at the beginning, which don't quite show everything, so here's the whole big thing. The history of this castle begins with a tyrant from another land who came here to conquer. He brought architects from his homeland to mimic its designs, and used fear to coerce the land's natives into doing his bidding. With their assistance, the castle was completed in 1620. This tyrant, Constance Livingstone, invited his family to live in the new castle, set the natives to work as farmers, and established dominion over the land. It was his deplorable treatment of the natives that solidified his reputation as tyrant. The natives had long since been farmers on the land before his arrival, but Livingstone sought to make riches from the export of corn, and so ordered the natives to expand their farmland. To ensure that none would defy him, he kept family members in the castle as hostages, ultimately repurposing some as servants. The natives held in the castle were forbidden from speaking their native tongue and were made to learn Livingstone's language. If they made any attempts to flee the castle, Livingstone would mercilessly punish their family. For a time, Livingstone made a massive profit in taking the natives' corn through heavy taxation and exporting it back to his motherland. However, he forced cultivation with a continued disregard for the natives' traditional farming methods, resulting in nutrient-poor soil and steadily diminishing crops. This left the tyrannical family impoverished, but they were no less strict on the natives and would not come to any compromise. If ever a thing did not please Livingstone, he would subject the natives to hard labor, torture them, and kill them to raise his spirits. One man was said to have been cut in twain with a giant blade sewn back together and displayed as a scarecrow in the fields. A parent and child were said to have been pushed onto a bed of spikes and pierced through the hearts, their corpses then left to rot for a month. One woman was said to have been burned alive before her husband's eyes. It is thought that these horrible deeds were not only intended as cruel punishment towards the natives, he also simply delighted in watching people despair over losing those who they held most dear. After Constance's death, his descendants followed in his footsteps, bringing suffering upon the natives for many an age. But finally, in 1778, the natives revolted. They invaded the castle, kidnapped the Livingstones, dragged them out of the castle, and had them executed. Another note, in the Japanese version, there are actually subtitles for highlighted words that catch Keith's eye and make him clear that the castle had some bad history. I didn't actually get sent this until later, close to the pass-around key puzzle, which I guess was around the time Uri worked out how she was rationalizing having a castle in America. It was also sent alongside Livingstone and his daughter's diaries in the notes, although the former didn't get the English pictures or anything. But yeah, she noted to me how she knew it was strange and came up for an excuse that she wasn't too confident in. She also said the natives were based on the Cherokee, though it's not clearly stated. Of course, you can tell that from the names. Bring Me a Dream. After part 2 of the script, up to Keith waking up to find Helena gone, Uri decided it was time to finish on finishing the Sandman, and did so. Toward the end of Sandman development, Uri got the idea for preview videos and had me help translate the Boogeyman one. Then when testing began, she suggested the simultaneous English release, and I did the translation in about 3 days once testing was complete. The timing worked out such that Uri tweeted, "I'm so sorry, it won't come out in February," and then around 11:30 p.m. Japan time, haha, never mind, I lied. After that, Uri could focus on developing the Boogeyman, apologizing profusely for her delay in writing more of the script. Her method from then on became to actually more or less create a chunk of the game, then send over the script. Later, she took advantage of this process to provide screenshots in the script, which were sometimes helpful. Something strange is happening. Uri asked me if it was strange to use was, W-U-Z, for the graffiti. Obviously, it was not. Catch Me If You Can was, of course, given in English and pointed out as a reference to the movie. Uri even specified the quotation marks. I wasn't aware of the truth of the cell scene when I translated it, so the translation is a bit strange and probably not quite what it should be. Helena repeats "daijoubu" a lot in it, and at that point, it seemed natural she would be saying she'd be fine. However, in full context, she doesn't so much care about her own well-being. As Dick points out in the happy ending, she and Keith are very selfless, and she sustains injuries as she runs from the Boogeyman. Instead, she's reassuring Keith, who she thinks is in the Boogeyman's captivity, that he's going to be okay, that she'll try to save him, and she won't let herself die, since Keith will be next if he does. Saving the Grundlers, excuse me. For Lance's reaction to seeing the Boogeyman, I just wrote "eek" for some reason, so the "yeah" was basically all nervous. Speaking of the voice actors doing their part, Richard's encouragements to Sophie during the events were ad-libs Uri told his actor to do. Originally, there was going to be a sofa in the room to the right of the spikes, which you push under Richard to try and do the opposite thing, dropping Richard and catching him. However, if you tried that, the spikes would pierce the sofa due to Richard's weight and you'd die. This was scrapped, and while I don't exactly know the reason why, I'm guessing it was probably too hard for a player to predict that would happen. What's in the box? The box scene is a Seven reference, of course, and that part of the script is titled, What's in the Box? David's swearing after the reveal was specifically requested as stronger language than David would usually use to show how genuinely upset he is. The water pressure part of the Shirley rescue was going to be much more involved at first, apparently. Odie asked me to translate some text on the control panel, which implied you had to press buttons that added different values to get it up to a certain point. One can probably guess why that was dropped. As I made mention of earlier, the boogeyman outright called Shirley a coin locker baby in Japanese. The more natural wording that I ended up using in the translation was, dump her the same way her parents dumped her. Where's Sophie? The Oingo Boingo lyrics were, of course, given in English. While the game says question mark, the script simply says it's the boogeyman's voice, so there's that. I don't like the chess puzzle either. In Japanese, the hint is literally just, if the battle does not begin. When it showed up in the script and Uri said the solution was putting them their positions before the battle, I assumed it was saying to put them in their actual chess starting positions, and while that would have been really annoying if true, yeah, I'm not sure what her logic was. Anyway, I tried to make the hint more reasonable by talking about back in the camp, but I still think it's a really iffy puzzle. From the flashback with Sophie and Helena, Sophie feels happy but embarrassed by Helena stroking her face and turns red. Having not had a mother for most of her life, she hasn't experienced this kind of thing much. For the boogeyman meeting Sophie before sicking the dogs on her, Uri gave the instruction to sound much more unemotional. She actually described it as how Brendan is trying to act, and said the view from Sophie was important to show how the boogeyman really is. Yet Keith sees something very different. Brendan is trying to be a terrifying movie villain, but Keith sees what he perceives as his enemy, someone who reminds him of his own former joking self, which he feels is to blame for his failure to protect others. After saving Sophie, Keith warns Richard about not keeping an eye on her. When I translated the script, he just said, Shinu zo. I wrote, don't take your eye off that brat, Richard. She'll be the death of you. However, I think Yuri caught that it should have been the opposite, since he was speaking from the experience of losing Todd. Thus, I'm assuming it was her who changed it to, it'll be the death of your daughter. I didn't realize this until the completed game, so I had to leave it like that to match the voice line. But I was able to change it to, it'll be the death of her, in the voiceless version. Faint. Keith's dream about Helena that changes meaning depending on your route was originally written in English, but it slipped Uri's mind to give me any context about the idea. The stage directions only described the bad version where Helena strangles Keith. So I wasn't sure what was up with it until I asked and got Japanese translations that showed me different meanings in each version. I did have to reword a few things that were in awkward English. Uri described it as modified from lyrics she liked, but I'm still really impressed by the idea. Hear a phone. The doctor, after Keith confirms Todd's death, used to have the line, there's been 3 incidents just today. It's just not a good day. But it just got taken out since I guess it sounded out of place. After Keith gets yet another call in the hospital hallway, he suddenly stops and glares at empty space. He feels like he hates someone enough to want to kill them, but doesn't know who. Desperately suppressing his urge to scream, he goes back to walking. When Keith assumes David hates liver, given them both hating anchovies, Uri was unsure what to put for what ended up as liver, asking if I could come up with a similar food to anchovies. And actually my first thought was liver, but I didn't say it. And then she came up with it independently. Well, it's not the first time. There's a huge explanation in the script of David's thoughts about Keith during their conversation. To summarize, he has to wonder how Keith can be so calm if he really does value Helena. He feels there's no way he'd be as calm in Keith's shoes. So he questions why he goes so far protecting people, wonders if it's merely pride or something more, and how the notion of pride bothered him back when he was in flight school. In fact, David wonders if he had done the impossible and become an Air Force pilot, he would have ended up like Keith. While he speaks, Keith feels his heart calming down slightly. He had never told anyone about his fear of phones, and never intended to. It would have showed weakness. He doesn't know why he ended up telling David about his trauma. He considers that maybe it's because David is honest, doesn't poke fun at what people say, and would earnestly listen. After talking with Lance, Keith always tried to be unfazed by everything, handling things calmly so that he wouldn't cause anyone to worry. However, in this urgent situation, young people like David and Lance are causing him to feel restless. What upsets him the most is having others have to tell him he should be upset about Helena not being around. I will beat him up. Keith's taunts toward the boogeyman are ad-libs. The subtitles were probably just for the sake of the Japanese translation, but I figured I should keep them, and they're necessary for the voiceless version anyway. He's got some keen insight, I'll give him that, was another mistake, and could only fix in the voiceless version. As you can pretty easily tell from context, Dick is actually saying that Richard was clever to have picked up on the oddity of Brendan's death. It'll soon be sunny again. Even once the last script was done and the actors finished their lines, Uri still had a lot of work to do. Since she'd skipped over them for the time being, she had to draw all of those many illustrations. Her plan to do them while watching the Stardust Crusaders anime every Friday night didn't last long at all, and had to edit over 1,000 voice clips. Even after all that, there was still some lengthy testing due to all of the opportunities for bugs, and it was slowed down further by her dog having surgery. Oh, and not quite relevant, but Uri revealed to me that there was going to be a Paranoiac movie months before anything was publicly announced because she just had to tell someone. Aww. Anyway, the game was finally tested, bug-fixed, and sent to me to translate by the end of August. Non-dialogue generally wasn't in the script, and thus I hadn't translated it in advance, so that was the main thing. Though I had mentioned at the start, I also had to check that the dialogue matched the voice clips instead of leaving it exactly how it was in the script. At the very end, I found 2 issues. First was the readme said in the part about the skippable cutscenes, shift equals skip to the scene. Oops. Or shift equals skip the scene. Oops. The second had to do with the character bios. Uri gives the heights in feet and inches in the Japanese version too. However, something was odd. At first I thought it was just a typo, but I realized most of them were weird. You see, Keith was listed as 6'10", which is pretty tall. Helena was 5 feet and 24 inches. That's really tall. Stevie was 5 feet and 57 inches. What? Then I realized Uri had pretty much decided the character's heights in centimeters, converted them to feet, then replaced the decimal point with the foot, the quote, the singular quote, which we use for foot. So that was really good. I felt sort of bad, but honestly, I really enjoyed that I got to write an email explaining it to her. If you take this literally, Stevie is a 3-meter tall giant at 5 foot 57 inches. And that's pretty much the whole story from my perspective. It was an experience, and my conclusion was that a translation spanning over a year and a half isn't exactly something I want to experience again. Uri feels similarly and has certainly learned lessons for the future. But it was really great working so closely with Uri and seeing the game unfold the way I did. So long, a boogeyman. Now for Uri's thoughts, which go on for a while because she does talk about each voice actor. Boogeyman, bonus thoughts. This is a really long, 2 years overdue thing Uri wrote about the Boogeyman's characters and the voice actors. There may be some overlap with the notes I wrote from my experience, but Uri obviously has more to say in detail. Here I've written mainly about each of the voice actors and characters. As usual, they're long and rambling paragraphs, so it's best for those who have some time to kill. Also, there are many spoilers, so I don't recommend reading this if you haven't played the game. About implementing voice acting. The Boogeyman was made with the assistance of many voice actors. If you're wondering why I decided to add voice acting, it's because I wanted the Boogeyman to be as much like a movie as possible. And after all, the trailer was initially included the Sandman like a movie preview. Though when I say like a movie, I really mean like a B-movie. However, I'm hopelessly incapable of speaking English. There was no chance of me compiling a fully English script, and I could scarcely even write out the details for an audition. That's why I tweeted out about how full English voice acting would probably be impossible, which is when the ever-helpful VG Person-san made offer of assistance. Truly, VG Person-san's kindness can race across continents. And so we began quietly organizing things in the shadows. First, I asked her if there were any suitable sites to recruit voice actors, and she directed me to Voice Acting Alliance, apparently a place where amateur voice actors could announce themselves and you could hold casting calls. Okay, let's register there, or so I thought, but I can't. For some reason, new user registration was halted at the time. So I talked with VG Person-san and decided that while there would probably be much fewer applicants, I would try inviting people via my own site and Twitter. The audition period was set short at 2 weeks, because I thought I wouldn't get the people I needed anyway, so I may as well finish it up quickly and see the harsh reality. I set up a regular publicity tweets on Twitter and made an audition page on my site. Surprisingly, I had applicants within the day it was announced. Quite a few, in fact. some who I'd had communication with before, and some who I'd never talked to at all. I told the former, I'll be recruiting voice actors, so that I could understand, but how could there be so many of the latter? I marveled at it. Later I realized that VG Person-san had also posted about it on her own Tumblr. For real, VG Person-san's kindness soaks deeply into my internal organs. I received a total of 47 applicants. I was as happy as I could be about it. About selections. All the applicants who submitted were really very good, so selection was a difficult process. Keith received the most submissions, and I truly agonized over him. I'll go into the reasons I chose each voice actor and how it turns out later, but here I'll explain in general terms how things came about. The first thing I paid attention to was if the voice matched my vision for the character. Though I talk about vision, in the audition post, each character only had a description of about 2 lines. In other words, it was damn useless. Besides vision, it was also about the types of voices. I wanted everyone to have distinctly different voices, if possible. That's probably most striking with the female cast. I believe I found unique, personality-matching voices for Helena, Shirley, and Sophie. Another reason I stubbornly insisted they fit my idea of the character is that I'm very susceptible to other people's influence, so if I chose someone who didn't match my vision, I felt like it might alter the character's personality in the script as well. Thinking about it now, there are of course characters who changed in a good way from such influence, and it wasn't a negative thing at all. But the point is, at the time of auditions, that's the way I was thinking. The next thing I paid attention to was how they read the lines. In other words, their performance. Keith has a ruthless feel, David has an honest feel, Lance has a smarmy feel. This also has to do with my vision of the characters, but I considered whether their way of speaking fit with the style of character. For example, with Keith, all the applicants were very skilled. However, many of them read the lines quite emotionally, which I felt didn't agree with the Keith I was trying to make. My reasons for choosing each voice actor will be detailed later, but suffice to say everyone performed very well, and I struggled to choose on that front. I even made a chart in Excel and tried to give each person a score. Even looking back now, it's apparent how difficult the selection process was. The last basis for selection was audio quality. Though I've been in a band and messed with its effects a bit, I'm a complete novice at sound. And all I have for post-processing is Audacity. There were a fair number of people who met the other standards, yet I had to tearfully remove them from the running because of bad audio quality. I continue to regret the fact that some may have been fine if I had just a little more skill with audio. In summary, selecting voice actors was highly difficult, but also a fun time. Having other people voice the dialogue you thought up is really neat, and I learned that what I'm thinking regarding I want the character to talk like this can't fully be expressed with the lines of dialogue alone. At first I intended to write the scripts with no notes on dialogue, letting the voice actors read as they liked, but the auditions made me rethink that. The voice actors I chose really did a good job expressing the feelings of the characters. By the way, this is a secret. As I was about to contact the voice actors after selection was done, I realized I hadn't made a reference for character details, so I tearfully stayed up all night to write one. I mean, I usually don't since it's just tedious. Stupid reference materials. Next, I'll write some thoughts about each of the characters and their voice actors. Keith Baring. Neon-sen. First, to summarize what character Keith is, he's a character created and presented in a clearly different way than the Crooked Man and the Sandman. Let's start with how he's created. He's on the chasing side. David and Sophie were chased around by strange entities, but Keith's obviously different. I suspect this didn't occur to many people, but whenever the boogeyman sets up some trap, Keith can quickly figure out what he should do by chasing after him. For the Lance rescue, if you go into the room the boogeyman escapes into, you can destroy the mechanism. For the Grundler rescue, you have to do something down in the pit the boogeyman jumps into. For the Shirley rescue, you go into the room the boogeyman comes out of to find what to do. They all have that structure. For Keith, chasing down his enemy leads to solving the case and uncovering the truth. This is suggested in many places. However, as Keith himself says in that silly final battle, he just needed to protect the hostages and wasn't even thinking of doing anything with Boogie. As a police officer, saving lives comes first, and the self-blame from losing his own son gives him a powerful obsession with protecting others. Taking down Boogie is secondary to him. All he wants is to ensure the safety of the hostages. So what happens when he does chase down Boogie? Well, as seen in that idiotic last battle, he wins easily. Also, the act of chasing isn't limited only to him versus Boogie. If you get items like the videotape and the voice recorder, Keith can see and hear the scenes of his wife being chased by Boogie. I want you to imagine this. If he's chasing after Boogie, who's chasing Helena around, isn't he also indirectly chasing Helena? Keith is chasing after Helena with Boogie in the middle. This very setup is what I was thinking about when I decided to make the boogeyman. Catching Helena, who's running from Boogie, is as simple as just capturing Boogie, but because Keith's putting hostage safety first as he's a detective, he thinks catching Boogie isn't essential. Yet in reality, it's not unneeded at all. Keith needs to do it to get closer to his wife who's trying to run from him. With Boogie in between, Keith will never be able to reach Helena. He puts up with this, but in truth wants to see her again as soon as possible and wants her safety most of all. In The Crooked Man, David says he could have become a crooked man himself. Keith, too, is on the verge of becoming the boogeyman in a sense. He himself states that he and the boogeyman are similar in that it's all a lie. The two paint themselves with the shell of lies to play the part of someone powerful. In this game, I intended to avoid any extraordinary entities like monsters or fairies, and instead go for a constant portrayal of monstrous humans. It's like Nietzsche's famous quote, "Beware that, when fighting monsters, you yourself do not become a monster. For when you gaze long into the abyss gazes also into you." They came out very messy, but simply put, Keith was a person whose feelings and actions wouldn't coincide. Fret or get angry as he would, he couldn't let that show as a protector of the people, and though he wanted to catch his wife as soon as possible, he couldn't even do that. In the last battle, he goes ahead and announces to Boogie the beatdown he's about to administer. His reason for this is simple, he says. Boogie chased after his wife's rump. Here, he's smiling. He has saved all the hostages and left Helena's rescue to David, so he can finally do as he pleases. Shedding the mask of detective, he can return to being a normal man who acts on his desire to get back his dear wife. In his flashback with Todd, he summarizes his true thoughts with, "I'm not going to let anyone mess with you or Mom." And when Todd asks if he'll beat up the boogeyman because you're a police officer, he replies, "Because I'm Dad." A scene he's able to remember just before the final fight. Now, regarding Keith, how Keith is presented as a character, that's rather apparent. Keith doesn't talk to himself. He doesn't ever go, "I wonder if I could use this for something," glance. In other words, he doesn't help out the player. Because Keith doesn't vocalize his thoughts, the player doesn't know what he's thinking. So since he doesn't suggest what you should do, it's hard to act. So I imagine some felt distaste and irritation towards Keith. David tries to be a friend both to that uncooperative Keith and the player, but I'll get into that later. I said earlier that I struggled with choosing Keith's voice actor as the most, but Neon San was the one who stood out among the pack as matching my vision of Keith's character. Neon Sad ran the audition sample lines in a slightly angry way. Personally, I thought of Keith as a man who truly didn't express any emotion, so I thought that scene should really be without emotion. But Neon San's irritated reading here was very good, and I realized that voice could also work really well. To be honest, I'd felt that skillfully as other applicants performed, none of them stuck as Keith. Yet after hearing Neon San's performance, I quickly thought, that settles it. Upon putting his voice in game, it fit really well. I even put him in the preview. The call with Dick is still one of my favorite scenes. Neon San was really skilled at expressing the occasional slight emotional cracks in the typically emotionless Keith. He also had no issue acting out his nihilistic and pessimistic sides. Though I was unsure about picking Keith's voice actor, every time I put Neon San's voice in the game, I felt his voice aligning with my image of Keith and was so glad he took the part. I still muse over how the boogeyman probably would have never gotten finished if not for him. As an aside, I was personally really struck by the cute disconnect between main game, Keith's normal speaking, and Neon San's message in the bonus room. Neon San's bashful voice is really very cute. Helena Bering, Serene-san. Helena, like Keith, is a bit of a hard-to-understand character. The player sees Helena from the same perspective as Keith, so due to his shock and confusion after she brings up divorce, the player sort of also becomes unable to gauge her thoughts and actions. Though if you make it to the game's finale, you understand that protecting her husband is what drives all her actions. So I was concerned that people might dislike Helena at first, but I see a lot of people who like her, so I'm relieved now. Helena understands that she's a cowardly, weak person, and her husband Keith is obsessed with protecting others out of guilt from losing their son. She always thought to herself that maybe being with Keith just put additional pressure on him. And upon seeing how Keith wasn't having any fun at all, even in their long overdue vacation, she felt her beloved husband was at his limit and brought up a divorce because she didn't want to be a burden on him anymore. She calls herself weak, but she's not really a weak person. She simply understands her weaknesses. In this respect, she's the opposite of Keith, who can't confront his own weakness. Helena learned that as soon as Boogie caught her, he was going to kill Keith. On the recorder, Boogie says, "It's up to me if he lives or dies." So she keeps running from Boogie. Running from him is the one thing her weak self could do to protect her husband. She's really a strong-willed woman. With an understanding of her weakness, she's vowed to protect her husband in the way she was able. That's sort of a woman-esque strength, I suppose. If Keith is an oak tree, Helena is a reed. Rather than being unmoved by the strongest gales, she won't yield to the most intense rapids. Having a married couple as main characters is rare for free horror games, so I wanted to express their separate strengths. Of course, men and women all have different kinds of strength. I wanted to also express that difference in David and Shirley, but I'll go into that later. It's hard to properly express writing it out formally like this, but I wanted to depict Helena as a marvel of a woman. She looks weak, but isn't. She's kind and empathetic towards others, but has her own will. She seems cowardly, but strikes back at Boogie. From a masculinity-based perspective, a woman with such strength seems unusual. She's adaptable and multifaceted. I think Keith might have liked that about Helena, how she's hard to get a handle on. He's an intellectual sort, so a woman he can't entirely understand is charming to him. I'm forgetting what I wanted to say here, but Keith doesn't make Helena submit to his manliness or something. It's actually quite the opposite. What he says to Helena in the last scene, "Let me get down on my knees," that basically describes the relationship I wanted to depict. I made the relationship between these 100% following my tastes, so I could go on and on about them. And as for the voice actress Serene-san, she was the most cooperative in many aspects. We talked about an incredible amount of Helena's performance. Helena doesn't have much depiction of her thoughts until the latter half, so her feelings up to then had to be expressed via dialogue and tone. So I always told Serene-san in detail, "I want you to say this like this." However, I also made a serious mistake. The way I pictured Helena speaking was Nicole Kidman from Bewitched, so I told Serene-san that I wanted her to perform like that. But listening to her recordings and the retakes she did, it seemed she was forcing herself a bit to use a higher-pitched voice. When I checked with her, it became clear I had come across as not picturing Nicole, but asking her to do her voice. My instructions, which I'd given in English, had been faulty. I apologized profusely and had her do retakes where she didn't strain her voice to be higher. I'm truly sorry. To give an evaluation, she was excellent at getting across all Helena's gracefulness. I honestly think that's amazing enough, but even in scenes where she's crying, scenes where she's softly reprimanding, scenes where she shouts, she kept Helena's distinct softness. Helena's a difficult character, but Serene-san's always questioned me right away when she didn't understand or was wondering about something, and with a deep understanding of the character, she performed excellently to the end. I'm really happy someone with such solid talent and solid attitude took the part. By the way, I've received a few wonderful presents from her, like from my birthday and the Boogeyman 2nd anniversary, though really I received them not from her, but from a group of the other voice actors and fans under her leadership. I'm not one to care about birthdays or anniversaries, to the point where I even forget my own birthday, so I was both very surprised and incredibly happy. The Boogeyman, Devasity-san. The biggest difference between this and the previous entries in the series is that the villain, Boogie, talks a whole lot. The Crooked Man hardly ever speaks, while the Sandman speaks, you don't know what he's saying. In order to give the Boogeyman a B-movie-like story, his character was absolutely essential. He's a character who uses mutual understanding in a backhanded way, leading people by the nose with his words. From the conception of the story, it was clearly decided in my mind what his personality was like and how he spoke, and I'd even thought up most of his lines. Incidentally, I'd pictured him sort of like the Joker from Batman, but not the Dark Knight. That's important. As such, I wanted to pick a voice actor who'd fit that perfectly. As for why I went with Devasity-san, see further down. I think the most notable thing about the character of Boogie is his painted face. It's usually grinning, but from scene to scene, it'll turn angry or sad. Of course, it's paint, so it's inconceivable it's actually doing that. Thus, in the end, it's revealed how only Keith could see that, and the other attendees saw something repulsive, the way he looks during the final fight in the good ending. Also, Richard's questioning makes it clear that his speech and behavior were completely different from what Keith and the player saw. So why did he look like that to Keith's eyes? Because Boogie is Keith's enemy. Furthermore, he's not his real enemy, he's a fake. In the flashback after David's death, Keith and Dick have this conversation. I want an enemy. You've got those all over the place. They're all fakes. They're all smiling. I want an enemy. One that, if I kill them, it'd put an end to all these stupid incidents. Afterward, it shows all the criminals Keith's had to deal with, and he thinks to himself, it's not you. And the dead criminals' faces are somehow grinning. The enemy Keith wants is a perfectly immoral, undeniable evil. He's not necessarily talking about criminals, but some greater evil that can't truly be embodied. Keith's ideal enemy is someone he can defeat to put an end to all crime and sadness. So the individual criminals he finds here and there are fakes to him. Fakes who grin and scoff at him. Dick responds to Keith's desire for this ideal enemy who can't exist by saying there's no such thing, and if there is, it's only in his head. So it'll die when Keith does. Now let's take a look back on the lines from Boogie's first appearance. All the evil and sadness in the world can be blamed on the Boogie. The Boogeyman is the king of evil and terror. Boogie declares himself to be exactly the ideal enemy Keith wants. Keith comes to the erroneous conclusion that Boogie really is his enemy in Bad End 1. He shouts at Boogie, "My wife, my son, give me my family," even though his son died in an accident unrelated to Boogie. And yet he blames it on Boogie and demands he give him back. In short, he goes and admits Boogie is his ideal enemy. Like Dick says, what you have to do to kill that ideal enemy is kill yourself. So that's how Bad End 1 concludes. So how does this change if you go through the game properly for the good ending? Before the last battle, Keith says to Boogie, "I guess we were pretty similar after all, in the sense that it was all a lie. You and me are just acting. You're no scary monster, and I'm no paragon of justice. You're my enemy? Spare me the sleep talk." Here, Keith recognizes that Boogie is not the ideal enemy he sought, but another fake. And he understands that the enemy he desired was just trying to be the ever-composed and dependable was just an illusion. I think this is an important point Keith has to come to. Once Keith sees through Boogie's face as fake, his grinning face changes to show its true colors, the repulsive appearance Richard talks about. Well, but as repulsive it could possibly be, he's just another criminal like Keith deals with all the time, so he gives him a beat down. By the way, when Boogie shows up when you play as Sophie, his face is always dark, hiding his expression, but this Boogie has the face that Richard was talking about. That grinning face was only how it looked through Keith's eyes. I chose Devasity-san out of numerous auditions for the role of Boogie because he perfectly fit the image of Boogie speaking in a mocking way. I thought it'd be fantastic to have that in the sense that he's always scoffing at someone, whether it's when he's pretending to be angry or when he's pretending to be sad, so I settled on him. Once recording actually began, he fit astonishingly well as Boogie. Speaking in a perfectly fitting way for Boogie's expressions, he added color to many of the game's scenes. Being able to bring out such a mood is another sign of a great acting ability. When I play the voiceless version now, I really start to miss Boogie's voice. I was so happy to have him lending his wonderful talents to voice Boogie. David Hoover, Roseanne. In The Sandman, the position he should have had was stolen away by Lullaby, but he leapt out to have an important role in The Boogeyman. Said role is to guide Keith. In his first scene on the boat, seeing Keith trying to work his broken lighter, he offers him a light. This was a metaphor for offering a light to Keith, who's in darkness. Now let's discuss exactly what kinds of things he does. First of all the male victims of Boogie are assigned roles as mirrors that reflect Keith. Lance is Keith when he was younger, Richard is Keith when he was a father. For example, Lance seriously freaks out when Boogie's about to kill him, and seeing Lance like that reminds an emotionless Keith of the terror he tasted when he himself almost died as a newbie detective. And Richard, who's so loving towards his daughter and willing to do anything for her, has the love for family Keith once had. In that way, all the characters are made to resemble aspects Keith has or had. So what about David? He's the mirror of Keith as a husband, with the duty of showing love for his wife. David and Shirley are married, too. David, Lance, and Richard have roles of showing Keith his former self so he can get back what he's lost, but David is especially important here. Because after Helena brings up divorce with Keith, he knows repairing his relationship with her is urgent. David shows concern for Helena multiple times through the story and thinks it's absurd Keith is so calm in spite of his missing wife. He attempts to dig back up the concern for his wife Keith won't show others, but is actually just hiding. And when Shirley is missing, David is incredibly worried, and when he finds her captured, he risks his life to save her. And then once he does safely reunite with her, he trusts her enough to leave her behind while he goes to accompany Keith. It's a completely different situation from the Barings, who worry for one another, but as a result, can't trust each other. Keith appears calm, but these actions of David's actually shake him to his core. In short, David repeatedly shows Keith what a husband looks like, a side of himself he lost. In addition, David has another duty. At first, he's an entity who lights up Keith's darkness, as I wrote. But other than his duty to reflect Keith as a husband, the places where that's really shown are the conversation in the room when Saturn devours his sun painting, the talk after the flashback to Todd's death, and when you watch the third tape video. In those scenes, David has these lines. There's a big gap between your ideal and what you really want. It's contradictory. Isn't that painful for you? You're clever, so you're trying to fool yourself, but you can't fully deceive yourself. Deep in your heart, you still blame yourself. Even if you only protect what you really feel is important, no one will blame you for it. These are lines that only David, the protagonist of The Crooked Man, can say. Keith's ideal was to be a strong man unmoved by anything, but in reality he didn't want that, so he just acquired that ideal from blaming himself for failing to protect his son. To put it another way, he's been asleep, averting his eyes from his weakness, unable to accept his son's death. At the start of the game, Eric asks Keith, "Are you asleep?" And he replies, "I was just thinking." He denies that he's asleep, still held down by his son's death, and is putting on a facade, so that's his response. But after watching the third videotape, the conversation between Boogie and Helena, David asks the same question, "Are you asleep?" And Keith responds, "I'm awake." Here, he recognizes his weakness, can wake up from his slumber, and resolves to beat up the boogeyman who messed with his precious family. I think the power of David's words is key in stirring him awake. David, too, was in despair after his dreams fell apart, driven to nearly killing his mother and himself. As mentioned in the conversation near the Saturn painting, Keith knows about that past of his. That's why his sincere words are able to move Keith the most. In The Boogeyman, David is Keith's senior at recovering from the depths of failure. I heard many voices in the auditions, but Roseanne's was the one that surprised me the most. Personally, I imagined David's voice like Henry's from Silent Hill 4, and wrote as much in the audition post, but honestly didn't expect to get someone with such a soft and calm voice. So I was seriously shocked when I heard Roseanne's, especially which was such a shoo-in for the part. I don't think this is just me. Even now, I hear people say, he perfectly fits what I imagined for David's voice. Not only is it a fitting voice, his performance is great as well. I think that he was able to express various emotions while keeping that unique softness. It's just enough to make you think for a second, was David based on Roseanne? I'm really so grateful to him. Sophie Grundler. Chocolate-san. I was actually anxious whether Sophie, the protagonist of the previous entry The Sandman, would be accepted by the players. As those who play the Sandman know, her personality changes quite a bit. In the previous game, she was mostly only being depicted all gloomy. Well, she broke out at the end. In The Boogeyman, she carries on with that newfound openness. She doesn't show self-denial and makes her thoughts clear, and her father spoils her a fair bit. In essence, she's become rather childish. That's how she is now after overcoming the last game's story, but I was worried people who liked her in The Sandman might not be open to it. In fact, I still worry that. Sophie, like David, is important to the ending branches in this game. Whether she lives or dies connects to the ending because, since her father Richard represents Keith as a father, Richard's daughter Sophie represents Keith's child. This should be apparent from the scene after how Sophie versus the dogs, where Keith scolds her. "Can you even imagine how much you worried your father, you idiot?" And that reminds him of the line he said to Todd, "Why don't you do what I tell you?" Sophie symbolizes to Keith the child that he loved yet couldn't protect. Whether or not the child survives is huge for him, which is why her well-being determines the path he goes down. David has the same sort of purpose. When questioned by Dick, Sophie states that she knew Boogie wasn't actually the boogeyman, but a human. You might remember if you played the Sandman, but while hiding in the cupboard to escape the Sandman, she encountered the real boogeyman. So she can tell that Boogie isn't a monster or anything, just a human. Well, except in truth, none of the tour victims believe that Boogie was the actual monster, the boogeyman. Still, in that chaotic situation, I think many had this fear like, is he even really human? In this case, maybe he's more of a monstrosity than a monster. Richard saw through to part of the truth via Keith's words, but Sophie saw another aspect that Keith couldn't have known. The Grundlers might actually be pretty amazing, huh? Like I said, I was worried about Sophie's personality in The Boogeyman, so I was also very uneasy about choosing a voice actor for her. Quite a few submissions came in for Sophie, but most of them are rather mature voices. Choco-san's voice fit in the childish category. I ultimately went with Choco-san because, in addition to fitting the idea of Sophie being more childish compared to the Sandman, it kept the voices distinct between her, Helena, and Shirley. The ladies in this game really demonstrate some diverse personalities, so I wanted the voices that fit each and also stood apart from one another. Those are the reasons I chose Choco-san at the time of selection, but once recording began, I found myself constantly moved by their acting ability. I was shocked at how, while always keeping that bright and adorable teenagerness, they precisely expressed joy, anger, and sadness. And after the release of The Hanged Man, I should note that Choco-san was also able to perform a college-bound Sophie in a different way still from The Boogeyman. Compared to The Boogeyman, the performance is a bit more emotionally subdued, so some players thought, isn't this a little monotone? But I don't think so at all. I feel they voiced Sophie expertly, from childish Sophie to slightly matured Sophie. By the way, the post-game bonus scene was quite a hit. I really loved Choco-san's peeve performance in the scene after being teased by Keith. Though I always felt it in the other scenes as well, I get the sense that only Choco-san could play Sophie, and this is where I feel it most strongly. Their participation made all of Sophie's scenes that much more colorful, and I'm deeply grateful for it. Lance Canal. Nervous-san. Lance was a popular character, with quite a few telling me I want him in more games, and indeed I'm very fond of him as well. His personality can simply be described as smarmy but cowardly, but he's actually a dedicated justice seeker too. When Keith tells him about Stevie's death, he angrily asks, "You couldn't save him?" and objects to Keith's message of restraining Richard when he loses it, shaking free of Keith to accompany Richard. In the biography I gave Nervous Sen, I wrote, originally a photographer-journalist, he wrote articles that dug up the truth of criminal cases. But while looking into the case of a girl who was raped and murdered, his info-gathering techniques were called into question by civil liberties organizations, and he retired as a journalist. After that, he started to dislike taking pictures of people and became a photographer for a landscape-oriented travel magazine. So yes, he's actually someone who wants justice in his own way and pursues the truth. And yet, after he was condemned and driven out of his occupation, that failure turned him contrarian. Perhaps Lance and Keith are similar in the sense of failure changing their lives. Because of that, they're also similarly sarcastic. They appear to not like each other, but maybe that's only because they are reminded of themselves. As I wrote in David's section, Lance serves as a mirror to reflect Keith when he was young. In the Saving Lance event, Keith shows some rare sympathy for the terror Lance felt and consoles him. Because in terrified Lance, he saw his former self. In addition, Lance's most important job is the conversation before the Bad End 4 route's last battle. Stop saying crap about shoulds and shouldn'ts. Listen, I know, deep down, you think we're just annoyances. Don't really care what happens to us, because ultimately, we're total strangers. And you're sketchy as hell for trying to hide that. Why you gotta hide that? If we're just in your way, say it. Don't go so far protecting us that you'll kill yourself off. If you want to save your woman right now, then do it. These lines are incredibly direct and impassioned by Lance's standards. He hits Keith with what he really thinks, when usually he's sarcastic and keeps it hidden. Keith can't possibly call Lance and the others annoyances, but in this situation where he wants to save Helena ASAP, they honestly are. So Lance guesses at that, and on top of it tells him it's fine. Until then, he thought Keith is a cold person who tried to control others, but after hearing the truth from him, he reconsiders. Lance was formerly a journalist, so he actually has a good eye for people. He saw through to the fact that Keith actually thought dearly of his wife and wanted to save her deep down, so albeit crudely, he encouraged Keith with honest words. To repeat, Lance reflects Keith in his youth, so this scene is really designed to be like Keith's younger self encouraging him. Bent out of shape by failure and painful experiences, his course is corrected by his former honest self. In this game, Lance ended up being given the role of firmly encouraging our astray protagonist. Honestly, once I heard Nervous' son's example in auditions, I chose him immediately. He's really good at that smarmy way of speaking. I imagine his message in the post-game bonus surprised people. His voice when he's not acting is entirely different from Lance's. I can tell just how well he understood Lance's character and how to portray it. Not to mention, while this matters to no one but me, the voice recordings he gave me were really clean, which was a huge help. I couldn't name a single problem in voice, performance, and quality. Incidentally, he also did an interview after release, and I was happy to have a fun chat with him. Shirley Weber. Arak-san. I wrote how David was important for reflecting Keith as a husband, and Shirley has a somewhat similar role. Or rather, perhaps I should say David and Shirley together show Keith how a married couple should be. First, to describe Shirley in a word, she's strong. She calls herself a dunce for having been kidnapped and nearly killed by Boogie, and sees her husband off to help Keith while holding an axe over her shoulder. The complete opposite of the seemingly weak Helena, the two also have a completely different relationship with their husbands. The Bering style is to protect each other from whatever harm might come to the other, while David and Shirley fight with their backs to one another. This relationship of theirs is important to show trusting your partner. They can go back to back because they trust one another, and they can cover their partner's weaknesses. Their relationship shows trust much more strongly than the Berings, who try to protect each other so much that they've lost it. Personally, I think the most notable scene of hers is in the Bad End 4. Always tough during the incident, here Shirley becomes sullen and talks about when she temporarily broke up with David. This also connects to the Hanged Man a bit, but Shirley got along well with David's mother, and heard about how depressed she was when her husband divorced her. As a result, and having been abandoned as a baby, she was very anxious about becoming a part of someone else's family. In the material sent to the voice actors, I wrote this, which sums it up. She was a dumped baby unwanted by her parents, so she had a sense of distrust for family. With no relatives, she had to do everything by herself to live, and she was scared to join anyone's family or depend on anyone. Everyone around her sees her as a strong woman who can do everything by herself, but she's really just scared of getting too deeply connected to anyone else. She found it too hard to bear David's kindness and tried to run away, but ended up coming back to him. Then she vowed that she wouldn't have him protect her, but live protecting him as well. Though I said she's a strong woman, she does have such weaknesses as well. And it's her awareness of those weaknesses that resulted in that vow. All that considered, she's definitely a strong, independent woman. Usually tough, but sometimes showing weakness, Arak-san performed that character of Shirley splendidly. In auditions, I felt her clear speaking and acting were perfect for Shirley and chose her. But even in scenes like the aforementioned where she shows some weakness, there's also the conversation after David's death, she was skillful at doing a very different performance that shows Shirley's sadness and unease. I was surprised to hear her in post-game message that Arak-san did have prior voice acting experience, but mostly in only young boy roles. After all, she gave such a solid performance of a mature woman with a strong side and a weak side in The Boogeyman. I was certain it had to be something she'd handled many times before. Personally, I'd like to see The Boogeyman lead her into trying more such roles in the future. Richard Grunler, Winterson. The thing I was worried about most before starting auditions was, would there be any applicants for Richard? After all, he's age 45, and I described him as a timid old man who dotes over his daughter. I was ready to admit defeat, thinking I probably wouldn't get submissions for that kind of voice acting in a free game. So I was shocked to hear Winterson's voice and performance. He just fit so well. To be honest, I heard a sample and implemented it immediately. What kind of character is Richard? Players of The Sandman might know a little, but he's diligent and a bit weak for his daughter. Until the end of The Sandman, he gives a slightly cold impression as someone who immerses himself in work without caring about his daughter. But in the end, he speaks out about his true feelings and even asks, will you forgive me for neglecting her all this time? The Sandman ends with him finally showing that sweet side, so it was fun to actually dig deeper into his personality in The Boogeyman. He's actually timid, but works hard at his job in finance and has a clever side. He's the oldest character, so I suppose his ability to see through people and things is advanced as well. That's why he's able to see the case calmly from his own perspective, as he reveals in the ending. As stated before, Richard reflects Keith the way he used to be as a father. Seeing him worrying over his daughter and getting upset and crying, Keith is reminded of his former self. Before going to search for Sophie, when Richard clings to him, supposedly emotionless Keith shows some clear disgust, right? But after pushing him away without thinking, he returns to his senses and apologizes. Some have supposed this is because Keith doesn't like having a guy clinging to him, but naturally that's not it. At that moment, Keith sees Richard echoing his past self, a father who's powerless to protect his child, and so he unconsciously thrusts him away. Also, when you do the Sophie dying route and Keith has to restrain Richard from going out and killing Boogie, Keith shows a rare pained expression and apologizes to him. He knows the pain of losing a child, so he feels deeply guilty for making Richard experience it too. That's a weak point Keith would have never wanted someone to attack back when he was a father. In that sense, maybe Richard is the one who shakes up Keith the most. I told Winterson I wanted him to speak gently, but when it was about Sophie's safety, to give an almost excessively out-of-sorts performance, and he knocked it out of the park. I believe he understood and expressed Richard's feelings so well I could come away thinking, maybe I didn't even have to give specific instructions. Also, he played the doctor who appears in Keith's flashback, who speaks totally differently from Richard. I was shocked at the breadth of his talent. I won't just say he was the perfect voice for Richard. Winterson surprised me in many ways on the performance side. I'm truly happy he took part in the project. Brendan Dumont. Toby-san. Honestly, Brendan is a character I don't really want to explain, even to those who have beaten the game. Of course, I have thought about the details of his thought process and such, but those things are fine being only known by me, and I don't want to tell them to players. He's a monstrous human, so explaining in how, in this part, due to this reason, as the villain, he did this, it kind of puts a damper on things, right? Well, and to be frank, he has no real motive that I can explain with words. It's because he did those things with no motive that he's a monstrous human. So for those confusing reasons of mine, I won't write any considerations on his character. I won't, but I will provide this excerpt about his past from the document I sent the voice actors. He was born into the family that owned the castle and hated to live in such a musty old place, so he went to film school. There he learned about special makeup and filming techniques and went to Hollywood to work at a small movie company. But he grew sick of living unnoticed behind the scenes, and with his born cruel disposition, he decided to conduct a game of murder, like a villain in a movie, and to make himself known to the world as someone to be feared. He then graduated and returned home to the castle, killed his parents, and received an enormous inheritance. In-game, it said they died in a traffic accident, but it was actually murder. Afterward, he proposes a tour of the castle to his travel agent to promote it as a place for sightseeing and searches for attendees. Once they're decided, he uses the detective agencies and the like to investigate their histories. The weariness with life described above, odd as it is for me to say, doesn't contribute with a true motive, I think. This part was really hard to describe, so I wrote it as his born cruel disposition, but long story short, it can all be summarized in those words. That is to say, the reason he caused this incident was because he's that kind of person. To change subjects, there's a manga I like called Soil. In this scene where the detective questions the culprit responds, this ecstasy has no true form. Search as you may, you won't get an answer, because this is not a mystery meant to be solved. I'd like to give the same answer of Brendan's motive. If you try to ask him, why did the culprit do this, the questions spread from everything from birth to environment to thoughts, and you only get one new mystery after another. Though Brendan is an illogical character, as I've explained, the personality he shows the world is a bright and diligent young man. That's what I told Toby-san, asking him to always be smiling and speaking in a chipper way. And indeed, Toby-san performed Brendan as a cheerful youth very well. Actually, the conversation between Brendan and the servants before you enter the castle was a late addition, but I was impressed with how he made it sound like a natural, friendly conversation. Also, I felt that he was quite ambitious and inquisitive, endeavoring to better his performance. Listening to it now, he expressed Brendan with such bottomless cheerfulness, it sways you into thinking, he's that kind of character. But when you go back after being it, you can think, so he's putting it on. It's a strange power of his performance. I imagine it's not easy nailing that two-faced nature, but Toby-san did it well. I think it's really wonderful. Dick Anderson, Manly-san. For the auditions, I declared that I would select applicants irrelevant of whether I knew them or not. At any rate, I wanted to prioritize the voice actors who best suited the characters. However, Manly-san is the one person I did know who I chose to voice act. That said, there wasn't any communication between us. It was just me knowing him. Previously, an English fan shared their thoughts and told me, I watched a Mermaid Swamp Let's Play. It was neat. And since the image of Japanese mermaids clearly differs from what they're like elsewhere, I wondered, how did foreigners respond to that? So I watched the videos out of simple curiosity, which were by Manly-san. In his videos, Manly-san actually gave explanations about Japanese mermaid mythology. Hearing those gave me the impression he was good at explaining things in a very conscientious way. And when I heard his sample in the auditions, I recognized how he could clearly distinguish between when he was talking in a mature and calm tone and when he was mocking or admonishing someone. I wrote this in Dick's biography, sent to Manly-san. In the Crooked Man terms, Dick is in the same position as Paul, but he doesn't go as far as Paul does to help his friend. Knowing Keith so well, he also knows how Keith hates people poking their noses into his business, so he can only watch over him. Dick is also good friends with Helena, and always worries if things are going well between her and Keith. He's the one who knows the most about the situation of the Baring couple. Dick has a good understanding of Keith and Helena. That's why I wanted to pick someone who could calmly admonish him. Manly-san easily brought across his droll, joking nature. Besides being someone who understands the protagonist, Dick has another very important role, providing explanations to the player. Up until the end, the player can only follow the story from the perspective of its protagonist, Keith. In other words, they can only see the truth of the case through the eyes of a third party. But at the end of the game, we go to Dick's questioning the victims as a detective, trying to unravel the details of the case. For the first time, the player can learn what this case was really like and the truth of everything. Dick's explanations don't end with the case either. It also extends to Helena's inner thoughts. He asks Helena about her feelings and, since he's also a detective, a father, and a husband, suggests what Keith's inner thoughts that she was incapable of knowing might be. Here's where the player can finally understand Helena's feelings. Why did she want to divorce Keith in the first place? I definitely wanted this explanation for the player, or a recap of the game perhaps, to be given calmly and exactly. For these reasons, I considered Manly-san to be very fitting for this role. So that's how Dick is a rather important character despite not showing up very much. I counted myself lucky to get someone so familiar with speaking like Manly-san. Besides being a faultless performance, his audio quality was phenomenal, and all I needed to do was adjust volume in the space between lines. Thank you for helping me in so many ways. Those are my thoughts on Manly-san. Okay, we've just got 3 more characters and a conclusion. I know this is going on for quite a bit. Eric Simpson. Seon-Rol-san. Eric is a character packed with qualities you don't want in a subordinate. Frivolous, cheeky, and lazy. He was originally a detective in a different division, but he acted way too rudely, so to get him properly reprimanded, he was assigned to work under Dick and Keith, infamously scary even among the police. But he quickly adapted to Keith with an arrogant attitude. But he quickly adapted to Keith and doesn't seem to get punished. He does treat Keith with an arrogant attitude, but Keith doesn't chastise him for it. Keith believes in meritocracy, so he probably doesn't concern himself with hierarchy. Also, concerning how Keith works with Eric without really raising complaints, maybe he actually thinks Eric has potential and wants to train him. Well, though Eric does make a certain screw-up in The Hanged Man, but that aside. By the way, he was the detective who questioned David when he was detained for trying to kill his mother. Eric had a sick grandmother at the time, so he sympathized with David and wished for his quick release. So I imagine if he met him again in The Boogeyman, he'd be surprised, but happy to see he's managed to be doing pretty well now. I say that because I did intend to include a conversation between Eric and David, but it was too short, so I cut it. Seon-Ril-san was great at performing Eric's cheekiness. In the very first scene in the phone call with Keith, I think his performance made things a little more comedic. Without Eric, those scenes would have just been gloomy through and through, but I think Eric's presence and Seon-Ril-san's acting gave those scenes a much more realistic depth. He did a really great job as the Boogeyman's comedic relief. By the way, Seon-Ril-san is really good at drawing. After the Boogeyman was finished, he drew a cute illustration for me. It's wonderful. I'm glad for the present on top of him contributing as a voice actor. Stevie Small, Jesse-san. Stevie may get killed off pretty quickly, giving him little time to shine, but he's actually pretty important for the development of the story. He's the first one you contact to get on the boat, and he indicates that you're going to have meals at the castle. Most important of all is that he's killed by Boogie as the tutorial for his murder show. Stevie exists to inform Keith that if he doesn't hurry and catch Boogie, the other tour attendees are going to end up like him. And that way, he sets the scene for what's going to happen next. He's the guide for the tour, but you may also say that he serves as a guide for the story as well. Stevie is 33, of the same generation as Lance. That's why he can be seen as having a friendly chat with Lance after eating. And so Lance is very shaken to hear that he's been killed. His personality is never properly depicted in game, but personally, I picture him as someone who can diligently carry out his work. There's the part where he asks Keith about meals, and generally, I think such a question would be asked by the castle servants. The servants, chefs, make the food after all. So why is Stevie asking? Simply because this tour was a test run before the castle opened as a tourist spot, so he knows the people in the castle are inexperienced with handling guests and takes on the duties himself. He knows exactly what needs to be done and gets right to doing it. Since I had that image of Stevie, I thought a voice actor who could speak clearly would be good. Jesse-san gave me an impression of speaking calmly without faltering in the audition, and upon recording, I found he fit my idea well. His usual smooth speaking is good, but I especially like when he talks to Keith about his wife playfully, showing a bit of his true self. Stevie's personality couldn't be shown off in a big way in the game, but Jesse-san added a sense of humanity to him. Though not a major part, I really appreciated the help. Todd Bering, and this is an Asian name, so I'm very sorry. Jin-Yon-san. Todd's part is an important one, to showcase Keith when he was a father. Until the flashback with Todd, the player likely only sees Keith as truly cold and emotionless perfectionist. But in his memories of Todd, he's shown to accidentally use bad words in front of his son and get nervous when he imitates them. In general, a charming father. Also, he's able to remember that he should beat up Boogie, not only because of his duty as police, but because Dad's not going to let anyone mess with you or Mom, thanks to that conversation with Todd. In all honesty, I wasn't too concerned about the voice of Todd. It's like I didn't find it necessary to be, since simply being a toddler makes him very different from everyone else. Still, I picked Jin-Yon-san out of the various applications for Todd since she could skillfully perform both being downhearted and playing around happily. Those are my reasons during selection at least, but after hearing the "Who taught you bad words like that?" "You did, Dad" exchange, I was really into her slight bluntness. Also, in the flashback before the last battle, the performances of being scared and worried were surprisingly fitting for Todd. Maybe I owe it to her performance for solidifying my rather ambiguous idea of Todd's character. I'm deeply grateful for her performance of Todd in various ranges. I'm still really glad she could play the role. Conclusion. I'm terribly sorry this is so absurdly long. Even still, I'm also sorry I kept you waiting for this bonus content so long after the Boogeyman's release. I knew it would end up extremely long and rambling, so I had a hard time making progress on it. Also, I want to close by apologizing to the voice actors at the top of my lungs, namely for being so damn slow writing the script. My process was start making the game, do auditions and choose voice actors, write script while making the game, so whenever production slowed, I couldn't write more of the script. As a result, the voice actors had to stick with me the whole time I was making the game. I'm so grateful they took the time out of their schedules to assist. It was my first time creating with so much assistance from others, but having the voice actors there always encouraged me when I felt discouraged. The Boogeyman's creation was roughly half hardship and half enjoyment. Mostly hardship during the process of making it, but after release, all those who call themselves fans have really made up for that. Though there are some ways in which I really behaved improperly, as someone who always quietly worked alone up until that point. Well, I'm grateful anyway. Personally, I think what I'm most glad about may be that I didn't burn out on the Boogeyman and went on to release the Hanged Man as well. Well then, it's been long, but that's all. I've written at length about my thoughts here, but I'm sure that there are mysteries still made not clear in spite of that. I hope you'll come up with thoughts on those. So long! So there we go. It was a lot about the voice actors. And I will, as always, post links to the respective pages if you want to read them yourselves. I know I have a tendency to stumble on my words. This is directly after my first stream of the Hanged Man, so I have been talking for about 3.5 hours straight. So I always have a sore voice. But that's it. This is the additional info for the Boogeyman. So have fun watching the Hanged Man.